We're interviewing fellow writer and researcher Matthew Alford, who is taught at the universities of Bath and Bristol and is now an independent scholar working on issues of American cinema, power, and politics. His latest book is Real Power, Hollywood Cinema and American Supremacy. And I got to say, I was really excited to see a new work on this arena of research.
Yes.
This is obviously an arena that so many in the both the conspiracy parapolitical communities as well as the Fortean and anomaly and paranormal communities have an interest in. The idea that the powers that be are not just manipulating the news, but also manipulating the popular culture through entertainment, such as major motion pictures. Mm-hmm. And this is obviously something that's been going on for a long time, and it's good to see a new text dealing in such a scholarly way with this issue. So our guest tonight is, of course, Matthew Alford. Matthew, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Hello, Matthew.
Hello, good afternoon. Oh, good afternoon where I am. Anyway.
It's good afternoon in London.
Yeah,
my favorite town, by the way. I love that place.
I'm having my morning coffee instead of my evening police state drinking game beer.
Yes.
But I figured it was a little too early for the other. But
it is.
So I first started noticing your works because of all the articles dealing with your writings on the influence of the military upon particularly science fiction films. So, of course, I first started seeing articles in places like the Fortean Times, but it was also being picked up by some of the more alternative parapolitical scene, like the folks at Global Research. And but, of course, you've also gotten some publicity in major newspapers and major media outlets. Tell us what the basic premise of the book was. What were you looking for?
Well, the book Real Power was really trying to see what cases there were of cinematic output that were actually challenging the basic premises of the basic assumptions about American foreign policy, namely the idea that it is a benevolent, that the United States is a benevolent force in the world that is there to promote peace and prosperity and democracy and so on. And that basic assumption, which is often called American exceptionalism, is not really challenged in Hollywood cinema at all. But at the same time, Hollywood does have an image, a popular image, of being a kind of left-wing, liberal, subversive industry. And so the book was kind of saying, that's just not the case, because if you look at the actual films that are produced, almost nothing provides any kind of, certainly no kind of fundamental critique of that idea of essential American benevolence. And in fact, many films provide quite serious mythology that's promoting the idea that America is this great force for good in the world. And of course, it is sometimes a great force for good in the world. It can be. But it is working invariably for its constituent interests, which are generally big business and oil and arms and various other interest groups, which are not always so edifying.
It's fairly well known that there was a great deal of government influence in the film industry, say in World War II. There was a lot of obvious propaganda there, but it's gotten a lot more subtle. To the point to where most people, I don't think, realize just how pervasive the propaganda is in American cinema. Isn't that correct?
I think that is, true. I mean, it was acknowledged that the entertainment industry kind of had to get behind the war effort during World War II. And it was a popular war and, the right thing to do. And so it was just kind of accepted that that's what the entertainment industry was there to do. But since that point, when we're talking about post-war American foreign policy, which has been rather more controversial, yes, at the same time, there has still been a continued military presence on set on many major productions. And of course, over the last sort of 15 years in particular, although this is as a hangover from the 1950s, the CIA has also been active at early stages of production of various films.
Well, let's start with, I guess, the lowest level of this, which I guess is the self-censorship aspect within the film industry? Because obviously that's the minimalist level at which these kinds of things could be either put in or taken out or just shied away from in general. I think more often probably shied away from, like anything that's going to be critical of overt foreign policy on the part of the U.S. is probably going to be shied away from these the big movie houses, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, at a low level, you've got individuals who are working in the entertainment industry are not liable to go out of their way to criticize American foreign policy. I mean, why should they? I mean, their job is to entertain, and they know that it would just come across as a bit political and maybe not an effective way of entertaining. So I think there's that sort of benign reason for why Hollywood is avoids that kind of critique. But then, of course, as your question implies as well, there are rather more nefarious, self-interested reasons as to why Hollywood supports American foreign policy as well. But yeah, I mean, the issue of self-censorship is, of course, there. Few people are going to want to go out of their way to challenge American foreign policy within a piece of entertainment. And there's a culture within the industry which is, not part of a sort of radical campaigning political spirit. So it's hardly surprising. I mean, these companies are major corporations, and they're owned by even bigger corporations. For example, General Electric own Universal. General Electric is one of the biggest corporations in the world, with multifarious interests, including in the arms trade. So, the mentality is of the people who are running the show there is just not going to create a cultural industry that's interested in social responsibility.
You talked about product placement in films, which has become a means of corporations who might not necessarily own the studio, but having some influence on film content. How does that work?
Oh, yeah. I mean, sometimes the studio will own the things that they product place. In the 1980s, for instance, Coca-Cola was placing its products in all sorts of movies because it owned one of the studios. So, in that case, it's a very direct way of being able to product place. But usually you've got several hundred companies that are wanting to place their products in movies, sometimes for quite large sums of money. So, for instance, one of the James Bond films covered over $100 million of its costs simply by having placements of cars and so on in there. And one of the effects of that is, and it's an indirect effect, it's not a sort of conspiracy, it's part of market forces, but it means, are you really going to have films that are kind of gritty social realism, challenging of established norms and myths, or are you going to have films that are just like things maybe blowing up a bit so that it kind of creates a conducive message to, drinking Coke or driving a car? Mm-hmm. And that's, something like Transformers or Fantastic Four. Mm-hmm. And those films didn't really start out as great subversive texts anyway, of course. Yeah. But at the same time, the enormous product placement in those kind of pictures just, cheapens them ever more, I think. Mm-hmm. Artistic, makes it basically impossible for more subversive political ideas to get in. Although, of course, in the case of Transformers, the Department of Defense was all over it anyway, so it was pretty shot from the start.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's kind of what we're getting at, is that this is a form of product placement on the part of the military, because if somebody wants this kind of hardware in their film, they're either going to have to purchase it, and that ain't going to happen, or they're going to have to rent it. And, who do you go to rent this sort of thing but the military themselves? And I would imagine that any product supplier that is supplying a product may have contractual requirements as to how the object or the product can be displayed. And that's, I guess, part of the rationalization on the part of the military, is that, well, we have the right to make sure that it's not utilized in a way that is misrepresenting what we want, how we want to be represented.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the Department of Defense has long had a program of offering military equipment, aircraft carriers, helicopters, men, and advice in exchange for being able to have a look at scripts and then say, well, we don't agree with this script, we want this changed and this changed, and that often happens. I mean, because, like you say, there's no other way, really, of getting hold of very large equipment. There was a film in the early 90s called Countermeasures, which I mentioned in the book, starring Sigourney Weaver, and it was to be set on a ship and they asked for cooperation from the Department of Defense. But unfortunately, the Department of Defense were aware that the script, which had been completed and greenlit and everything, and they were aware that the script was about the Iran-Contra affair, and therefore a very critical view of American power. And the DoD, in their notes about the film, said we've got no reason to remind the public of Iran-Contra. Now, that's an example where the DoD kind of slipped up, I guess, by putting that in print, because it gives the lie to the fact that they're just a kind of neutral body that's just providing stuff, and we kind of want to be presented in a kind of factually accurate way. Of course they want to be presented in a factually accurate way. They don't want a captain to be called a colonel or whatever. But the real agenda behind it is to get people into the armed forces and to polish the image of the armed forces, and furthermore, rather unpleasantly, to sanitize an often bloody history.
So how pervasive did you find this, not just passing on scripts, but actual direct attempts to revise scripts? How widespread is that?
It depends the extent to which you mean revisions. I mean, every script the DoD works on, it will pretty much require some kind of changes. I mean, something like the film Air Force One, which is incredibly a great glorification of the apex of American power, glorifying the president himself, glorifying the military, his secret services, and every aspect of it. But even on that film, there was wrangling between the Air Force and the Army, I think it was, who were, they just kind of wanted to promote their own part of, the Air Force wanted to put more of its polish its own image more than the other aspects of the armed services. So even on those kind of things, there can be a bit of infighting. I found that about 25% of films that depict American foreign policy over the past, say, 20 years have had DoD involvement. Maybe a bit more than that. I was pretty conservative with the way I sort of defined those parameters. But, a sizable proportion of films dealing with anything to do with American power will have the influence of the DoD. And then after I completed a lot of my research on that, the sort of early thesis on that, I then started looking more into CIA. And of course, CIA's worked on several dozen productions as well since about 1995, although perhaps more of an emphasis on involving themselves in TV.
Was it the mid-'90s when both the military and the CIA became publicly involved in the movie industry?